Hi, everybody. I'm Alan Hawkins. I'm the head of character animation on The Mitchells vs. the Machines.
And I'm Mike Lasker. I was visual effects supervisor on The Mitchells vs. the Machines. Thanks, everyone. We're really excited to talk about how we made this movie. When I came on, I got to meet Mike Rianda, the director, and Jeff Rowe, the co-director, and they introduced us to the project and just how it was related to Mike's family and how just he was so connected to every character in the film. And Mike wanted to have a movie that was made by the human hand, and it showed human flaws and how that was juxtaposed with robots and kind of like their perfection versus humans' imperfections. And you can see here various photos of Mike and his family and his dad who's actually wearing Rick's jacket, what we based it on. And because he was so connected, it really helped us connect with the characters. We got to see a lot of these early visual development paintings, and it helped inspire us. And our job was to come up with a new visual style. And it's something I was in charge of the look of picture on Spider-Verse. And coming off of that project, I was really intrigued and excited to have another opportunity to work on a project that really pushed visual styles that hadn't been seen before. And this one was very watercolored, very illustrative. And here you can see an early painting of the family. This was an early test that Lindsay Olivares did to start to figure out the style. This is very 2D, it's very early, but it's also really informative as to the look that they were after. I oversaw and worked on Spider-Verse. I oversaw look of picture. I supervised look development, texture, and lighting. And what was great about that project for us at Imageworks, it kind of it tore down all of the typical principles that we use to make 3D animated movies. And we had to kind of reinvent every aspect of it. And having gone through that project, it really prepared us to jump into another project that was really creative visually. And in these types of visual styles, you have to reinvent every aspect of filmmaking. So it's not just different ways you do hair and you build assets, but you have to reinvent depth of field and cinematography principles. And it's really just starting from scratch almost and working with the directors in visual development to come up with the final look of the film. So this image right here, when I came on the project, Mike asked if I could have anything, what would it be? And I said, if you could show me an image that was the closest thing you could get to how you thought this movie should look. So this was kind of the flagpole shot, the flagpole painting that we based all of our early work on. And we sat around and we studied this image. And things we looked at were the outlines, the brush strokes and shadows, how trees simplified, how shadows pooled on the ground. And really every aspect of this image we broke down. And it was super helpful to get this. And we did a lot of back and forth before we got this image to kind of work out all of these principles and exactly how they wanted to look. So the look of picture, the look of this movie was very watercolor inspired, watercolor brushes, watercolor marker, and you can see this in this painting. So what we had to do with our team is look at this painting and break it down into components. And when we could break it down into individual components, it would help us sort of break it up with our various team members to tackle. And we worked with visual development that provided us with this amazing sort of light guide. And typically, when we're in look development, we'll create shader spheres and we'll figure out how the materials are going to be and how the light's going to fall off. And this is actually a traditional version of that. So you can see how they showed the line work and how light bounces and how when you go from light to shadow, it's broken up by brush strokes. And I was so excited when we got this from them because it really was at its most basic form what the look is going to be. And they provided us a traditional media guide where they sent us brush strokes. What was great with our tools is we could feed these directly into our tools. So visual development had a hand in the actual look. So like I was saying, we broke the painting down into components. And one thing we figured out early on was outlines were one of the major components of this look. We used outlines and ink lines on Spider-Verse, but we had to come up with a new shader-based tool for this movie because the line work was much more integrated, much more watercolor. And a lot of the things we had to figure out was we needed our lines to respect lighting. So if it was getting hit by the light or in shadow, the lines would have to respect that. They'd also have to inherit the color of whatever they were on. So here, Katie's lines would have to inherit the color of her hoodie. And the other tricky part with them is you'd always want them to be a little bit darker and a little bit more saturated than the surface they were on. So we had to set up rules, and we figured this out just by staring at visual development paintings and just figuring out what the rules would be. Other parts of the outlines that we had to figure out were they had to come off the surface, they had to have width variation, and here you can see animation had lines for the facial performances too.
Yeah, so like Mike was saying, majority of what visual style of the look of the film comes from was done with some really cool render techniques, but there's a small portion of the inclines that were handled by animation, the character animators, mostly in the faces, but then also any extra like supportive lines, like if we needed a special crease in a shirt that wasn't happening from the simulation, or smear lines on a really fast piece of motion. So we had the ability to support all of the really cool render techniques with our own character animation ink strokes that would pass through the pipeline as well. So when you look at it, it may look like all one department that's causing the look of picture, but it's actually a little bit from lots of different departments that are coming together.
Another big component of the look was how light fell into shadow. And one thing we realized is, and one thing that the art department really pushed us to figure out how to do, was to use brush strokes to break that up, brush strokes and color. So we developed a shader where, taking art from visual development, we could feed it into the tool and have the light dynamically integrate with the brush stroke. So as light spins around, all of our brush strokes build up on each other in density. And here you can see the light turns around and you see the brush strokes breaking up the light to shadow transition. And it was really great because we didn't want it to feel locked down like it was mapped on. As a character moved, you really wanted to see them move through the brush strokes. And just, we had a lot of different types of strokes that we could actually figure out shot per shot what we wanted to use. And we had different projection techniques, different styles of brushes, and it created sort of a very free-flowing artistic feel where no two shots were the same. And I think that inconsistency really helps make it feel like it's a naturally painted image. So every image is slightly different. And what was great with the art department is once we did our first renders, they worked with us and we kind of diagrammed everything to figure out what should the speck on the skin look like, you know, every extra little specific thing. And here you can see how they mapped it out for us. Another angle of Rick in the kitchen. And the kitchen was really where it was like our test bed for the look of the film. So most of our testing early on was on Rick, and it was in the kitchen. So Rick, unfortunately, was our guinea pig for most of our look. We spent the most time on him, his jacket. And then the kitchen and sort of the Act 1 environments being the most handmade, the most heavy on our style. We spent the most time in development there. This is a shot build just sort of showing how all of the different elements come together. So we have our outlines and the artist can pick the width of them, how irregular they're in, how much they came off the surface and how illustrative they were. And they could dial in their brush strokes. We also had depth of field. We would bleed surface to surface that was driven by textures, and we use that in the characters and the background. So we really had about six to eight different style techniques that we would build. And here we put brush strokes into our depth of field, into our glows, so everything would feel cohesive. So the Mitchell family, our stars of the film. Here is one of the visual development paintings that we really based a lot of our work on. Some really great concept art. Here's the final shot based on that concept art, one of our early comps. And you can really see how much we would push the characters and their style depending on the time in the movie. Here you can see they're actually even more graphically treated than when they were in the house. And what's really great about these characters is their costumes really inform their personality. Rick being outdoorsy versus Katie with her artistic costume.
Yeah, there's a lot of personal references that informed all of these. Like, one of the important things for the film was realism and believability, and the belief was that the more personal and real and relatable you could make, the more audiences would connect. And even if it's a very specific thing from someone's life, like my dad's jacket, you know, your dad may not have had that jacket, but there was something similar like that in your life. And so Mike and Jeff and all of the creative team were always encouraging the crew to find specificity from their own life to help inject authenticity to every scene.
And so Katie, the star of our film, her costume was very informed by her love for filmmaking, for artistry. You can see it all over her costume. She writes on her knees and her pants and any exposed piece of skin, and her hoodie's got pins on it. And it just, it really just informed her character. And here you can see a bunch of lighting keys from various parts of the film, and just how he treated her in shots. And just the vibrancy of the colors too. Here's one of my favorites where, after the robots attack, we really push the colors in that sequence.
And a big part of Katie's personality came from interacting with that hoodie. There's a lot of development that went into it. And, when someone wears a hoodie, wears a jacket, they don't oftentimes, especially teenagers, just sit there and not touch it. You'll fuss, put your hands in the pocket, pull on the strings, things like that. We were always looking for those kinds of opportunities to find that special detail to put in every interaction. And what you see here is, I'll show you an example of kind of the evolution of a scene. So this is some storyboards from an early part where Kate and Aaron are talking about her leaving for college. So the boards are fun, but not particularly descriptive. There's one special move. The line changed a little bit, so it didn't really apply anymore. But once we got it into animation, we started exploring the scene. And next, you'll see some reference from our animator. And right off the bat, we're kind of just hitting the general marks. Nothing super special in there. And we use reference often to kind of get a really fast version of a performance idea out for discussion. So rather than animating it, we'll get the reference up there quick and say, oh, I like this, or this was a nice touch. And very often there's an improvisational nature to it where things come out that you wouldn't have planned either if you were sitting there trying to thumbnail and draw it out. So we started with that. We thought there was room to grow. And so we talked about her posture. And so we're like, okay, well, what if she was slouching? And we thought this was a big improvement and a very easy turnaround for the animator to just reshoot the reference. But it seemed like there was still some room to grow. So he tried a few more things. But around that same time, we had also started blocking the shot. So we did have this version, but once we saw it, we said, yeah, we do need to push that a little farther. So we explored even more, and he came back with this nice reference where the chair was flipped around. And we thought that's what we were looking for. That was a nice, perfect thing. And we liked it so much that we actually changed all the surrounding shots to have her interacting with the chair in that same way. And this is the kind of thing that we were looking for in every shot, like someone to not just be sitting as if they had been placed in the chair like a toy or a chess piece or something, but to have people really poured into their posture, to have them interacting with the environment. And everyone has seen someone kind of straddle a chair this way and sort of flop over it like this. And so it felt like a really nice kind of keystone for the whole sequence that we changed all the shots around it too.
So with Rick, we really had to learn how to create most of our visual techniques. He was the first character we developed, and we had a lot to figure out on Rick. And he kind of presented a lot of the challenges that we'd face for the rest of the film. How his hair groom would be and how his collar for his jacket. We had to figure out what would fur look like in this style. And we ended up combining texture maps, sort of graphically shading hair, and we actually groomed ink lines into the hair, which is something we had never done before. But yeah, we spent a lot of time on Rick, how we would shade his beard, his mustache, and really just every aspect of him is where we sort of just came up with all of our techniques. And you can see his outfit was really inspired by Mike Miranda's father, and his jacket was actually Mike Miranda's father's jacket, which I got to see in person. I was very starstruck by the jacket. Yeah, it was, and here you can see he's an outdoorsy guy, and his costume really informs you of that. He's got jeans that are worn, his jacket is really used, his shirt is very irregular and ragged a little bit. And yeah, he was really the beginning of the visual style for us. So then we have the robots, and these are the helper bots that were created by Mark, and they are very clean looking. They're really the opposite of the human world. They have very cool white metal on them. Here you can see some really interesting first shots that we did with the robots. And the tricky part with them is we had to take our handmade style that we developed for the family and start to tone it back into sleeker lines and more just technological looks. So our tool set had to be versatile enough to sort of evolve it and shape it so everyone still fit in the same film, but it could be cleaner with the robots and still messier for the humans. And here you can see the robots have prison pods that come out of their arms. They're very reflective. They've got these boosters with hot cyan colors. And they were really a lot of fun to stylize. And we tried to work with their reflections to give them a little bit of the show style. We boosted their colors. That was another way that we stylized them. So we tried to push and pull what we could to put them in the show style, but still keep all of their lines really clean.
So next up are what we call the stealth bots. I don't think they're named in the movie, but this was something that was a really cool opportunity for the animation department, and something that I personally got really excited about once it got sent our way. We started with this single image, at least on the Imageworks side, and these robots looked so cool to us that in the animation department we thought, we don't want them to just move like regular bipedal creatures. It would be a shame if we didn't do something really weird and unusual, because their designs are so cool and dynamic. And so we went and pitched that idea to Mike and Jeff, and they got really excited about the idea of doing something strange and unusual with them, and they gave us a lot of leeway to start exploring. So what I'll show you next are some final animation scenes. So this is what it looks like as the animators are doing it. There's no effects department or anything else. This is basically character animation using a bunch of tools that I'll kind of dig into a little bit and explain how they worked. But this is what it looks like for the animator. So in the next part, you'll see some early tests. And this was before we had any kind of a rig or anything more than just a model. This was exploring with just modeling tools in Maya, things like cutting apart faces or using geometry slicing tools, things like that. Just really exploring a different variety of ways of how to manipulate the geometry before we go in and create a rig, which is what you do for every character. And there's one frame in here that kind of accidentally ended up being sort of the most instructional, and it's this one right here. It's just sort of an in-between on one of the tests, but when we saw that, we thought, wow, that's really cool and mathematical, and it's got a really nice design and balance. And so that became the goal for a lot of the transformation shapes. And so we needed to figure out how we were going to achieve this in a rig. Around that same time, in the next clip, you'll see an early test based off of that one idea of the breaking apart shapes. An animator named Dylan Reed, who's one of our leads and responsible for a lot of the stealth bot development, started doing this test. And this is still just using kind of Maya default tools. This is not something that could publish down the pipeline. It couldn't be rendered. It's very temporary, but it's more about finding the feeling that we were looking for so that then we could develop our tools. Yeah, so we're starting to explore how we could do this break apart stuff in a way that passes down the pipe and in a weird, surprising kind of way. So this is a very stimulating clip. We got a little overboard with all the different shape changey stuff, but this is using a technique called Booleans, where it's sort of like cookie cutters. You can take out a piece of geometry or even create a positive space or negative space out of that geometry. And the thing about it is it's very unstable. It makes the character shape really hard to render. And luckily, we had some really smart people in the pipeline and look dev departments that were able to make it stable for us, because the nature of it is very hard to work with. And I'm still surprised to this day that we got anything that was able to make its way down the pipeline, because every time you make a change to the tool, it renumbers all the vertices. There's no way it would work if it was anything more than just a flat shader. And we had two colors on there, which I'm also amazed we're able to make work. So that was one technique that we discovered, and we felt like we needed a little bit more. So we developed this other tool, which is kind of an image or a tool macro, where every time you drag your mouse across the geometry, it does a series of commands. It cuts the geo and then also fills it in. So you can create edges and walls of things that never existed. These guys are technically hollow on the inside, but when you slice it, it bevels off the edges and fills it in. So with these two tools, we actually realized we didn't have a need for a rig. And one of the things that was really cool about that is that with these tools, no animator ever did it the same as another animator. There was not a series of pre-made rig controllers that made the same shapes. Every single artist chose a different way of interacting with these two tools. And so as a result, every scene in the movie has a different kind of transformation. We're not moving the same pieces around because the same pieces don't even exist from scene to scene. So the creative aspect of it was really cool and fun. And then the technical challenge of it, I'm amazed we're able to make work because it's so unusual. So here's some more examples of it. And here you'll see some of the issues that happen with using these two tools. Sometimes the geometry will break or not get the right color that's on it. Things just disappear entirely. They'll be glitchy or inconsistent. So there's a lot of technical development that went into making this thing stable and usable. And then the next clip will show kind of the culmination. It's pretty simple. It's just a recreation of one of the moves from the earlier test. But this is done using all of the tools and all of the development that I just talked about. And it made its way down the pipeline so that it could be rendered and lit correctly. So that was a big win and a big step forward for these guys. Here's the animation again. You can see how all those tools were in effect. And for this scene in particular, you can see here, we have a little time lapse of how these broke apart shapes were moved and animated. So it's relatively simple. You just move the pieces around after you cut them, and it's up to the artist to create a nice, pleasing design out of it on their own. And so this is another scene animated by Dylan Reed, which is one of my favorites in the film. And it was one of the earlier ones too. It really defined the look of the characters and how they broke apart. Next, you'll see basically the final version of it. There's really cool lighting effects that Mike and his team put on top of it. But it's largely, as far as the shapes go, owned by the animation department, which I think is surprising based on how it looks.
So while characters posed a lot of challenges, look-wise, animation-wise, environments posed some of the same, but some completely different challenges that we had to figure out. Going back to our original look of picture image, we studied the trees and the grass. And one thing we realized is a lot of the leaf detail and the grass detail would simplify into just brush strokes. And here you can see one of our primary tools, which we call the patcher, was a tool we developed on Spider-Verse for Gwen's World. And when I came on this project, I really thought that we could take that tool and sort of bring it into this world and keep evolving it and developing it so we could use the simplification and the brushstroke patching technique with our trees and our grass. And what was really cool is, for say the grass, we actually groomed it like we typically would with hair, so we had all that underlying detail. And then with this patcher tool, we would convert it into big swaths of color. Because you never want that high frequency detail, you really just want it simplified. And here you can see the really beat up lawn of the Mitchells with its brown tones and its green tones, and it all simplifying together. And for the trees, we built them differently. We would actually build leaves, but within the clumps of leaves, we would build core geometry that would fill in the negative space. And then we'd also have little objects we called post-its, where we'd actually have little like squiggles textured on. And then we would simplify it all together for the end look that was very illustrative. And the thing about vegetation, trees and grass, you see it throughout the film. You actually see more of that than you do the characters. So we knew once we landed on the look for the environments, for the vegetation, it would really just add to the cohesiveness of the style. And obviously the textures and the clouds and the sky all had to play together with that. Here are some other examples of our visual development paintings versus our final renders. This is Rick's cabin, this is the painting, this is our render, this is one of our earlier tests. But we could already see how the different trees and the grass were really gonna work, and even on the cabin itself using the same techniques. We really knew we were onto something when we were able to look at the painting of the house here and everything that was going on in the painting. And then if we go to the next frame, here we go. Here's a shot from the film of the house. And you can see a lot of the same techniques in the trees and the lawn, on the grass in the foreground. So once we started landing on the house and the exterior and the interior, we really knew we were on to the handmade style the directors were after. The inside of the Mitchell's house was our test bed for everything. And the directors wanted sort of a found lighting style. It was a little bit messy, overexposed outside, little dark inside, stuff everywhere. And it just lent itself to it feeling like a real place, a real set. They wanted the audience to feel like people actually lived there. And just every different frame of the kitchen of the house shows that. And here's Aaron's bedroom. And you can see how his bedroom kind of informs his personality. It's filled with dinosaurs. We would build the models a certain way where we would have irregular bevels and edges. And so for every aspect of the pipeline would play into the style. So we would build our models a certain way. We texture a certain way. The materials would be a certain technique. And then it would play into our look of picture stylization that was put on top. And the following are paintings of Katie's bedroom along with renders that we did. And you can see in her room, very messy, very real, all of her loves of movies, posters on the wall, puppets. It really speaks to her personality. And just we figured out how to do carpet, do lighting in here, very kind of moody, dramatic. So every room in the house sort of helped us figure out different techniques. And the Dino Stop presented another host of things we had to figure out. When we first started working on the exterior, it was actually one of the first images, if you go to the next one, where we really felt like we were landing on the style. This was one of those images where we saw where it was starting to get hard to figure out what was a painting and what was a render. Here, the background is a matte painting, the foreground is a render. And when we landed on this, it was one of those aha moments where we really knew we were getting it. And then once we go to the car was a character in itself. We spent so much time in the film in this vehicle, we had to hero out every inch of it. So we took every prop we would need for the whole movie, we put it in there, and then we textured it and made it look very beat up. And here you can see a lot of time was taken on how worn the textures and the seats were, how the steering wheel looked with its beat up camouflage leather. And we had to kind of get close to every inch of this thing because the camera was just going to be all over this car throughout the film. Once we started moving into the PAL world, we had to take all of our techniques and bring out bolder colors. We had to take our irregular lines and make them cleaner. And we had to come up with a very clean style that was still in the style of the movie, but adjusted so you really felt the difference. And here's some early renders and images of the PAL auditorium with the motion graphics. The Robot City was the epitome of perfection, where it was the most robotic, the most computer made, and the city was extremely complex, with effects driving attributes that would help change colors. We had energy flowing through walkways, and we had pods with magnetic boosters going up and down these tracks. So it was a very complicated yet very simple glossy rendered environment. So it's really, if you look at the house and you look at this, completely different environments, but wanting to all fit in the same look. So what was interesting about the mall, and we had a bunch of sequences in the mall that were very memorable. One of the things about a mall is you have stores. And we basically built two modules to create the mall. We had an atrium and a hallway. And in both, we had to create mall stores. So on Spider-Verse, we developed a shader we called the Magic Cube. And what it would do is it would take a plane and we would create a virtual depth to it. And within that depth, we could add layers and layers of abstract shapes for the ceiling, for the walls, for the floor. And what we did on this movie, we took it one step further so that the visual development team could really design every store in the mall, feed us the file, and the tool would just dynamically split it up into layers. So we were able to create 30 to 40 different stores that were all designed, all illustrative. And it wasn't until we had that it really felt like a mall. And here you can see a bunch of the Magic Cube stores and how they are split up by layers. Going back to the Robot City, just all of the layers that went into it. So here's a final shot. And then what was really cool about the robot world is, like the human world, where we worked with visual development for a render guide, they gave us a look guide for the robot world that was the same thing, but different, adapting it to robot materials. And here you can see all of the different things going on in the city, all of the different effects that went into it, energy flowing through the walkways, all of these different shapes changing, all driven by effects. And it was this living, breathing city, but it was actually robotic. So everywhere you looked, you'd see different motion going on. And then, of course, we've got PAL all over it. And here are all the different departments in this shot. So that's the final shot. Here's rough layout where we lay out the cameras and the blocking. Here's animation. Here's lighting without any render script or comp. And then here's the final shot where you get all the glows and everything for the final image. So the effects in this film presented a lot of challenges as well. We wanted to come up with a graphic and an illustrative technique to do effects that fit into the style. So what we ended up doing, and here are just some shots, we had to, these are a bunch of final shots of the film that had effects. And we used a lot of different looks. We had very polygonal shapes. Here are the thrusters. And the thrusters used very polygonal simulations, which were really one of my favorite effects. And the thrusters actually had 6 or 7 techniques. Here's the freeze ray, prison pod, all staying within the style, but we had to develop a lot of new things. I love the Godzilla laser beam coming out of the Furby that would just electrify and burn everything down. Here are some layers of that. And what we typically did with our explosions and our simulations is we would come up with our typical sim, like this explosion here, and then we would convert it into camera-facing cards that we would then apply sprites to. So here you can see a typical explosion sim, and then here are the points. And then we would stick sprites on those points that would have brushstrokes. And then what would happen is we would have 2D artists paint over the simulations, and we would combine these graphic shapes with the smoke. And here's a library of fire and explosions that we would use. Here's another example of what I was just talking about, explosions mixed with 2D shapes. It was really, really successful.
Katie Vision is one of the coolest things I think about this film. And, once that idea kind of came to light, and there was a lot of it was kind of a bold thing. I remember some meetings where it was like, oh, how much are we going to do of this? Is it going to be too much? But I think it's something that really brought a lot of personality to the film and almost defines it in a lot of ways. Also, one of the cool things about it is that it was all done as a afterthought. We never planned a scene around a Katie Vision idea. Or if anyone did, they didn't tell me. We didn't do it that way in the animation department, at least. And what I think that gives us is a real feeling of spontaneity to it, as if the movie was filmed and then she went through and did the doodles where they fit in the scene. There were even some times where animators would pitch a Katie Vision type thing, and I shut it down because I wanted to be consistent with the idea that it was like a complete product that was getting manipulated after the fact, as if she was drawing on the frames or the film herself. So there was a complicated process of handing off the art back and forth between FA, which is usually more responsible for conceptual art that Imageworks then runs with, but they were actually animating them in Photoshop. There was a really small team of people. I think it was just 1 or 2 under Lindsay doing these really fun personality things. And one thing that people may not notice is that only Katie has the Katie Vision. No one else has a little idea blip or things like that. It's all something that helps show the film from her point of view. So here's some early kind of sketches that could have been for T-shirts, that could have been for Katie Vision. It's just sort of like Katie's mind sort of stuff. And then the next test, I think this one might play. Oh, here's just some early stuff on a paint over. I think this was a scene that was not yet animated yet, so a painting did all the expression and stuff. They were probably drawing over some layout, and then some really fun stuff. You could stop on almost any frame with Katie Vision in it and see something new from the last time, because it's so rich and dense with funny, silly imagery, and it always a little different. And something about it was intentionally made to be a little kind of wonky and bad, as if she was a new young artist that hadn't gone to film school yet or art school. And so she was just kind of working with her innate talent, and it was a little imperfect, which fits nicely with the theme of the film anyway.
What was great about it, they were very mixed media, and there were various levels of Katie Vision. You had little accent lines and blips sometimes, and then you'd have some that would just take over the entire scene. And here is a animation test that we did where we first combined it.
A whale. Now there's an animal. King of the ocean. Master of water.
Let's just move on.
Yeah, and like Mike was saying, it's not just doodles. There was also a lot of live like photography reference and stock photo theft type things and stuff where, she's just going to pull stuff from the internet too. And even though those images were not, CG renders, there was consistency to it. And I think it added to the sort of patchwork feeling of all of that, the sort of scrappy nature of Katie's art as it is.
And it was really the end of our pipeline typically. So we would get the Katie vision delivered to us from the art department, and we would generally really just put it on top of our final comp. We did little things like integration, some, getting the colors in line sometime, maybe adjusting edges. But in general, we wanted to feel like it was added on top of the final image because it was Katie creating it on top of the film. And I just really loved how it sort of brought the whole look together. So we already had created a handmade look of picture, and then this kind of added on top of that. And it just really worked well. And like Alan said, it kind of played with the performance because it was done, after the performance. And we developed a whole pipeline for it, and we ended up having a ton of it throughout the film, and it really added to the final images. This is one of the best ones. And it's such a aspect of her personality. But yeah, we want to thank you. We had a great time making this movie. I think the directors wanted the hand of the artist to be shown. And I think every artist that was on this film just poured their love and their heart into it. And it was a real family atmosphere. And the fact that the movie's about family was really true. I mean, we became a family as a crew. And, Alan, I don't know about you, but I just had a blast making this film.
I think you said it. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.